Rarely in history has a speech it so divided the world, and at the same time silently united it. When Trump took the Knesset rostrum and declared that it was not just the end of a war, but of the era of terror, the air seemed to stop. It was a simple phrase, but loaded with political gunpowder and prophetic weight. Many laughed, others fell silent, and some secretly felt fear. After all, who truly had the power to announce the end of an era? What if the terror he claimed to end had merely changed form, leaving the bombs to act on minds? What few knew was that behind the cameras, far from the glare of flashbulbs and the applause of parliamentarians, lay a plot woven with threads of power, faith, and economics. This wasn't just a peace speech. It was a manifesto that redefined the boundaries of the modern world. Trump spoke of reconstruction, but also of control, of faith, but also of strategy. Each word sounded like a seal on an invisible document that would change the fate of entire nations. And perhaps that's why, even months later, the echo of that speech still raises questions no one dares to answer in public. Is peace truly the opposite of war, or just its more sophisticated version? One thing is certain. The world was never the same after that day in Jerusalem, and what seemed like the end of everything may have been just the beginning of something much greater. That morning, the air endured, but it seemed different. The streets were quieter, and even the church bells rang with an almost solemn tone. When Trump entered the Knesset, Israel's parliament, the atmosphere was charged with historic symbolism. It wasn't just another diplomatic speech. It was a pronouncement eagerly awaited by leaders from around the world. The audience, made up of parliamentarians, journalists, and representatives of allied nations, maintained an almost reverent silence. Then he said, "This is not just the end of a war, but of the era of terror." And for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The cameras captured every gesture, every pause. Expressions ranged from surprise to emotion. It was as if the world, weary of conflict and headlines of destruction, breathed a promise that for decades seemed unattainable. Trump spoke with a firm tone, yet charged with restrained emotion. There was something different about this man, accustomed to harsh and controversial speeches. Here, he spoke with the weight of someone who knows his words could rewrite entire chapters of history. It was a cinematic scene, worthy of the great turning points the world rarely witnesses live. And as the applause rang out, many knew the moment wouldn't end there. The speech wasn't just the end of a conflict, but the harbinger of something much larger, a turning point no one yet fully understood. Some saw hope, others manipulation, and amid the applause and suspicious glances, a question lingered. What was truly behind those calculated words? Behind the eloquence of the within his speech, carefully constructed layers hid. Trump didn't just speak of peace. He spoke of power, dominance, and the redefinition of forces. Every word seemed rehearsed to provoke, to plant seeds in strategic minds. When he mentioned the age of terror is coming to an end, some heard liberation, others a veiled threat. It was classic Trump style, using the political stage as a symbolic arena where every sentence is a calculated blow and every silence a message. The metaphors were carefully chosen. He compared the Middle East to fertile soil that, for decades, bore the fruits of blood, but will now see reconstruction flourish. The image was powerful and dangerous. While it conveyed hope, it also made clear who would be the gardener of this new garden. The United States, under its leadership, would be responsible for planting this new order. And it was at this point that many realized the speech was not only pacifying, it was clearly founding a new doctrine. Behind the scenes, analysts began to decipher every expression, every omitted word. The subtext revealed more than the text spoken aloud. There was a project, an agenda, an attempt to transform peace into a tool of global influence. And curiously, the more he spoke of unity, the more an invisible dividing line was drawn between those who would walk alongside him and those who would be left behind. While the world applauds. Before the speech, few knew how much secret negotiation lay behind this apparent harmony. In the months leading up to the announcement, diplomats, intelligence agents, and military advisors worked in silence, crossing borders and ideologies. Discreet meetings in Dubai hotels, encrypted phone calls between Washington and Riyadh, and casual dinners in Geneva sealed the first drafts of the agreement. Nothing was improvised. Everything followed a meticulously designed choreography. Trump only entered the scene during the final act. Sources close to the Israeli government stated that parts of the treaty included previously unimaginable concessions, from humanitarian corridors in Gaza to promises of billions in reconstruction investments. The rhetoric of peace was accompanied by contracts and promises of influence. It was as if every word spoken in the Knesset had already been priced behind the scenes. Behind the rhetoric lay a web of interconnected interests, uniting governments, corporations, and the military under a single objective: control of the future. Some observers called this the deal that bought peace. Others, more skeptical, saw a geopolitical chess game, with each nation involved seeking to secure its next move. The question echoing among analysts was simple: to what extent was the ceasefire the result of goodwill, and not a carefully orchestrated global transaction? The answer perhaps lay in the reaction of the powers that watched from afar, calculating the impact of this new equilibrium. The reaction of the powers. The reaction was immediate and far from friendly. Moscow saw the speech as a harbinger of strategic imbalance, an attempt to reposition the United States as the supreme arbiter of the Middle East. Russia, which had been expanding its influence in Syria and Iran, realized that the end of the era of terror could mean the weakening of its own allies. On the other side, Beijing watched silently, calculating the impact that a new Washington-led alliance would have on its trade routes and energy agreements. It was like watching a chess match where Trump had just moved a piece capable of redefining the entire board. Iran, for its part, reacted furiously. It called the speech manipulation theater, accusing the former president of masking an imperialist project under the guise of peace. The harsh words echoed in Tehran, but also in Brussels, where European leaders expressed concern about the speed of change. The European Union, torn between supporting the U.S. or seeking diplomatic autonomy, found itself once again in the same dilemma: follow American power or pursue its own path. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was triumphant, at least in front of the cameras. Behind the scenes, intelligence reports indicated that both Russia and China had quietly begun talks about joint responses. It was the beginning of a new chapter, in which unlikely alliances were forming to counter American influence. Trump's speech, which seemed to merely end one war, had ignited another kind of conflict, a silent one waged in the shadows, where every move would be meticulously scrutinized. The map of the East, the Middle East, once fragmented by decades of hatred and territorial disputes, was beginning to be redrawn. Lines that once separated enemies now became frontiers of cooperation, at least in official discourse. Israel emerged as the epicenter of a new regional configuration, and devastated Gaza became the symbol of the promised reconstruction. Trump, alongside moderate Arab leaders, spoke of a prosperity corridor that would link ports, pipelines, and free trade zones. The project seemed too ambitious for some, too visionary for others. Meanwhile, historically rival countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan signaled openness to unprecedented collaborations. A trillion-dollar fund, according to rumors, was being prepared to rebuild infrastructure and modernize regions previously scarred by war. Peace, therefore, ceased to be merely an ideal and became a commodity, valuable, sought after, and highly strategic. Behind the smiles and official photos, each signature represented power, influence, and new avenues to wealth. But the new map didn't please everyone. Radical factions saw the changes as a betrayal. Entire communities feared losing their cultural identity amid the advance of the New World. What was called the era of Reconstruction also carried with it the risk of historical erasure. And while the West celebrated, the East watched, torn between hope and distrust, trying to understand whether this redesign would bring true peace, or merely a new kind of domination masked by promises of prosperity. The tone of the speech, although political, he emanated an almost spiritual force. Trump spoke as if he were preaching, not just giving a speech. He quoted biblical passages, mentioned prophets, and spoke of rebirth as if geopolitics had become a religion. Every sentence seemed crafted to touch not only minds, but hearts. He knew that in a region where faith and politics are inseparable, a word spoken with conviction can carry more power than 1,000 tanks. The rhetoric of hope, in that moment, became his greatest weapon. By mentioning a time when nations will learn to beat swords into plowshares, Trump evoked images of reconciliation and divine promise. It was a clear attempt to unite religious and political leaders under a common discourse, that of the spiritual reconstruction of the East. Analysts realized how strategic this blend of faith and power was. It created identification with the people and legitimized political decisions as if they were the will of fate. The speech took on a sermon-like tone, and the audience seemed torn between emotion and prudence. Behind the scenes, aides claimed the text had been revised by theological advisors and image strategists. Every quotation, every pause, had a purpose: to construct a messianic hero, a mediator between peoples. Trump, so often seen as a symbol of division, now positioned himself as a prophet of unity. But, as with every narrative of faith and power, one question remained: where does belief end, and where does manipulation begin? In the streets of Jerusalem, the reactions were as diverse as the accents echoing through the crowds. Some danced, flags in hand and tears in their eyes, as if peace had finally descended from heaven. Others watched silently, suspicious, fearing it was all just another political performance. In the squares, young people held signs with slogans like, "Hope begins here," while, a few blocks away, more radical groups burned photos and chanted, "Not in our name." The peace, seemingly achieved, seemed to awaken a new form of war, the war of narratives. In Gaza, mothers looked at their children with a mixture of relief and fear. The promise of reconstruction sounded tempting, but the memory of the bombings was still too fresh to forget. In Tel Aviv, business people and investors saw the agreement as a historic opportunity. Cafes buzzed with conversations about new businesses, tourism, and technology. It was as if the same event had given rise to two parallel worlds, one dreaming of tomorrow, the other fearing the return of yesterday. In the United States, reactions were divided between patriotism and skepticism. Social media was abuzz. Hashtags extolled the end of the era of terror, while others mocked televised peace. Amid applause and criticism, the global sentiment was unanimous. Something big had happened, but no one yet knew what would come next. It was the silence after the thunder, that moment when everyone waits, heart racing, to see if the sky will truly open or fall completely. The economic impact of Ac the Ordo began to take shape almost as quickly as the rhetoric faded. Stock markets reacted immediately, and oil prices plummeted as a direct reflection of the promise of stability. Multinational corporations were already planning their investments in the reconstruction of Gaza, while energy giants moved to control new supply routes. What was being heralded as an era of peace also became a race for contracts, influence, and financial power. Diplomacy gave way to economics, and peace, in a sense, began to be priced on the stock market. In the military field, the movement was equally strategic. Troops began to be redeployed, bases deactivated, and security agreements revised. But curiously, while talk of disarmament was ongoing, the arms industry was experiencing a new lease of life. After all, reconstruction also requires protection. New commercial alliances emerged between formerly hostile countries, and defense companies offered surveillance technology in the name of peace security. It was a paradox that few dared to discuss in public, but everyone understood behind the scenes. The new economic geopolitics transformed the Middle East into a laboratory of interests. Each nation saw peace as an opportunity for expansion, and each company saw a virgin market in a fresh start. Analysts began to call this phenomenon the post-fear economy. a system in which collective trauma is converted into profits. The end of the war, it seemed, did not end the disputes. It merely moved them from the battlefield. And, as always, numbers began to speak louder than words. The legacy of True's speech, MP's voice in the Knesset, still echoed long after the lights went out, and the microphones were turned off. Some called him a visionary, the man who dared to end a cycle of bloodshed and pave the way for a new global paradigm. Others saw him as the architect of a carefully constructed illusion. In one way or another, he had achieved what few leaders achieve, transforming words into events, and events into myths. The end of the era of terror became not just a phrase, but an idea that would inhabit books, documentaries, and academic debates. Historians were already beginning to debate whether that moment truly represented a rupture or merely the repainting of an old system. After all, every empire renews itself by disguising its intentions of salvation. The question loomed large over the world. Had Trump truly brought peace to the Middle East, or merely shifted the conflict to more subtle spheres, economic, cultural, and digital? Like every watershed, that day in the Knesset became a mirror. In it, each nation saw the reflection of its own beliefs, fears, and ambitions. But the true legacy may not lie in the speeches, nor in the promises, but in what came after, in the silences, in the discreet movements, in the watchful eyes of the powers that understood that the war had changed form. The terror, perhaps, was not over. It simply changed its face, and while the world celebrated peace, few realized that a new battle, invisible, silent, and ideological, had already begun. History often repeats itself, but rarely warns when he's about to do so. Trump's Knesset speech was more than a political milestone. It was a reminder that wars don't end only when guns fall silent, but when intentions reveal themselves. Peace may be just a strategic pause, and the end of terror may conceal the beginning of a new kind of control. The world applauded, but few truly understood what was being heralded. The dawn of an era in which battles are fought with speeches, currencies, and algorithms, no longer with missiles. And that's precisely why understanding the signs before chaos sets in is a matter of survival, not curiosity. Modern wars don't start out of nowhere. They're planned, rehearsed, and executed with surgical precision. They're in the news, on social media, in economic decisions that go unnoticed. Those who pay close attention see the pattern repeat itself. Those who ignore it become part of it. If you want to understand what really happens behind the curtains of power and learn to identify when the world is about to change again, I have prepared something essential for you. The ebook, 10 Signs That a War is About to Start. A revealing, straightforward and unfiltered guide that exposes the clues that precede every major modern conflict. Download now and discover what the powerful know, and what ordinary people only realize when it's too late.